I stared at the screen showing $0 in my wedding fund account. The same account that had $10,000 in it yesterday morning. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone. The coffee I'd been drinking turned cold on the counter while I refreshed the app 3 times, hoping it was a mistake, praying the numbers would change. They didn't. My brother Calvin had cleaned me out 2 weeks before my wedding, and when I finally got the nerve to call him, all I got was a voicemail that made my blood run cold. His voice came through casual and cruel. "Figured you'd understand, Will. I needed that down payment for the truck more than you need some geriatric backyard wedding. You'll bounce back." He actually laughed before hanging up. My fiancée Tina stood behind me in the kitchen doorway, watching the color drain from my face, watching my whole world collapse in real time. Before I tell you how my dead grandpa's rusted 1950s tool chest made Calvin lose everything he stole and more, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to that Tuesday morning when everything fell apart. I woke up that Tuesday feeling genuinely good for the first time in months. At 58 years old, after being alone for nearly a decade, I was finally getting married to Tina, a woman who made me believe in second chances and new beginnings. We'd planned a simple ceremony in my backyard. Nothing fancy or extravagant, just close family and friends who actually mattered. I had saved exactly $10,000 over 2 hard years, working overtime shifts at the hardware store where I managed inventory and helped customers find what they needed. Every single dollar mattered to me. I checked my phone while making my morning coffee, just a routine glance at my accounts, and that's when the floor dropped out from under me. The banking app showed my wedding fund account at 0. Not low, not diminished, but completely empty. $0 and 0 cents. I called the bank immediately, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs, I thought they might crack. The representative confirmed what I already feared deep in my gut. A withdrawal for the full $10,000 had been processed yesterday afternoon at 3:47 p.m. The account was joint, she explained in that professional sympathetic voice, set up years ago with my brother Calvin for family emergencies, back when Dad was sick. I felt physically sick listening to her. Calvin didn't answer his phone when I called. Not the first time, not the second, not the third. Each call went straight to voicemail, like he'd turned it off deliberately, like he knew I'd be calling and didn't want to face me yet. I drove to his house immediately, a small rental property he was always 3 months behind on, and found his driveway completely empty, where his beat-up old Chevy usually sat leaking oil on the cracked concrete. His wife Brenda answered the door, looking genuinely embarrassed, unable to meet my eyes directly. "He's at the dealership," she said so quietly, I almost didn't hear her. "He bought a truck yesterday afternoon, said it was a surprise, said it was for his work." The word surprise felt like a physical punch to my gut, knocking the air from my lungs. My wedding money had bought Calvin a brand new truck while my ceremony hung in the balance. I drove straight to the Ford dealership on Route 9, and there it was in all its glory. A brand new F-150 Super Crew, cherry red with chrome accents and fancy wheels, parked right in the front row like a trophy. Calvin was inside the showroom signing final papers, grinning like he'd won some kind of lottery he'd never entered. When he saw me through the plate glass window, his smile didn't even fade or flicker. He just waved cheerfully, like nothing was wrong. I walked inside the dealership and stood there waiting for him to finish his paperwork, my fists clenched so tight my fingernails cut into my palms. The salesman kept shooting me nervous glances, probably sensing the tension radiating off me in waves. "Nice, right?" Calvin said when he finally sauntered over, jingling his new keys like Christmas bells. "Crew cab, 4-wheel drive, the works. Needed something reliable for work, you know? Can't show up to sales calls in that rust bucket I was driving." I couldn't find words at first. My throat was too tight, my anger too hot and immediate. "You stole my wedding money," I finally managed to say, and people throughout the dealership turned their heads to look at us. Calvin actually laughed, a casual dismissive sound that made my vision blur red. He put his hand on my shoulder like we were old buddies sharing a joke. "Stole? Come on, Will, don't be dramatic. It's a family account, remember? Emergency fund. Besides, you don't even have kids to support like I do. Tina will understand once you explain it properly. You can have a wedding anytime you want. I needed this truck right now for my sales job. Image matters in my line of work, brother. He walked past me toward his gleaming new truck, boots clicking on the polished showroom floor. You'll bounce back, Calvin called over his shoulder as he climbed into the driver's seat, adjusting the mirrors like he owned the world. You always do, Will. That's your thing. I stood there in that dealership parking lot watching him drive away, the chrome gleaming brilliantly in the afternoon sun. The truck so new it still had the temporary tags in the window. When I finally got home an hour later, Tina was sitting at the kitchen table crying. Her phone clutched in one hand and tissues wadded in the other. Her mother had already called somehow, asking pointed questions about our wedding budget and whether we were still financially stable enough to host a proper ceremony. Somehow the word had already spread through town like wildfire. Small towns are exactly like that. I'd learned over my 58 years living there. Secrets don't keep for more than an hour. Gossip travels faster than actual news. Shame spreads like oil on water, touching everything, staining everyone. Is it true? Tina asked without looking up at me, her voice small and broken. Did Calvin really take all our money? I couldn't even answer her. I just nodded and sat down across from her, feeling older than I'd ever felt before, feeling like I'd somehow failed at the simple task of protecting what was ours. Tina's family started pulling back almost immediately, like they'd been waiting for an excuse to bail out on us. Her mother called 2 days later with that special voice full of pity mixed with judgment. Honey, Tina deserves better than this chaos, she said to me directly, not even bothering to sugarcoat it. A man who lets his own brother walk all over him, who can't protect his own money, who can't stand up for himself, that's not husband material. That's not the kind of man who can lead a family. The words cut deeper than any knife because part of me, a small, terrible part, wondered if she was actually right about me. Tina tried her best to reassure me, holding my hands and saying all the right supportive words, but I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes like shadows at sunset. Meanwhile, Calvin was everywhere in town, impossible to avoid or ignore. He drove that shiny red truck around like it was a parade float, like he was the grand marshal of his own success story. He parked it prominently in front of Ruby's diner, where everyone gathered for breakfast and gossip. He posted photos online with captions about hard work finally paying off and dreams coming true. People congratulated him in the comments, hitting like buttons, sharing his posts. Nobody knew the actual truth behind that truck. When people asked me about my wedding plans, I just mumbled something vague about postponing for family reasons and changed the subject as quickly as possible. The humiliation was absolutely complete and total. I was 58 years old, a grown man who'd worked his whole life, and my younger brother had made me look like a complete fool in front of the entire town. I went to see my mother, Marla, hoping desperately for some support, maybe even help confronting Calvin about what he'd done. She lived alone in the old family house on Maple Street, the same 2-story house where Calvin and I had grown up playing in the yard. When I told her the whole story, sitting at her kitchen table, where we'd eaten 1,000 meals as kids, she didn't look remotely surprised or even upset. She just sighed deeply and poured herself another cup of coffee from the pot, taking her time adding cream and sugar. Calvin has 2 kids to support, Will, she said matter-of-factly, like she was explaining basic math to a child. You don't have any children. He needs to look successful and put together for his sales job. People judge salesmen by what they drive, by how they present themselves. It's unfair, but it's reality. You'll bounce back from this. You always do, honey. Those were Calvin's exact words. You'll bounce back. I stared at my mother across that familiar kitchen table, and the realization hit me like cold water. They had talked about this beforehand. She had known what he was planning to do. Maybe she'd even approved of it, encouraged it. He stole from me, Ma, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside my chest. From my wedding fund. 2 weeks before my ceremony. That's not borrowing, that's theft. She waved her wrinkled hand dismissively, like I was making mountains out of molehills. It's family money in a family account. You'll bounce back. Calvin needs this more right now. I stood up slowly from that table without another word, walked out through the screen door I'd fixed 100 times growing up, and drove away. The betrayal wasn't just Calvin anymore. It was both of them together. My own mother and my own brother, aligned against me, seeing me as someone who could be used and discarded. I drove aimlessly for over an hour with no real destination in mind, just driving to escape the suffocating anger burning in my chest, trying to breathe through the hurt and betrayal. I ended up at the old family farm almost without meaning to, like my truck knew the way even when my mind was elsewhere. The property sat abandoned on Route 17, the place where Grandpa Eugene had raised our whole family before he died 5 years ago. The barn was still standing somehow, barely holding together with peeling red paint and a sagging roof that leaked when it rained. I parked in the overgrown gravel lot and walked slowly inside, breathing in the familiar smell of old wood, rust, and hay dust that brought back 1,000 childhood memories. Grandpa's massive tool chest sat exactly where he'd left it, a huge red Craftsman metal box from the 1950s, dented and faded by decades of use. I sat down on the dusty floor next to it, running my hand over the cold, scratched metal, tracing the outlines of old stickers he'd applied over the years. Grandpa had taught me absolutely everything in this barn: how to rebuild carburetors and fix lawnmower engines, how to measure twice and cut once to avoid waste, how to keep your word and honor your commitments. Calvin had learned exactly nothing from those same lessons. He'd always broken more tools than he'd ever fixed, lost more parts than he'd ever found. I tried opening the chest out of pure nostalgia, just wanting to see Grandpa's tools again, but the old lock was completely rusted shut, seized solid from 5 years of neglect and exposure to the elements. I walked back to my truck and grabbed a crowbar from my own toolbox behind the seat. The chest deserved better treatment than this rough approach, but I needed something, anything, to feel close to Grandpa again, to remember what it felt like to be valued and trusted. I wedged the steel bar carefully under the rusted lock mechanism and pried with steady pressure. The metal groaned in protest, and then suddenly snapped free with a loud crack. The heavy lid creaked open on protesting hinges, and I saw his tools inside, still perfectly organized even after all these years of sitting untouched. Wrenches arranged by size, screwdrivers sorted by type, hammers hanging on their designated hooks, classic Grandpa organization. But something immediately felt wrong to me. The tools didn't sit flush with the bottom of the chest like they should have. There was a visible gap underneath them, maybe an inch of empty space. I lifted the entire tool tray out, and my breath caught hard in my throat. Underneath was a false bottom panel, and resting on top of it was a yellowed envelope with my name written in Grandpa's distinctive, careful handwriting. My hands were actually shaking as I picked up that envelope and carefully opened the sealed flap. Inside was a letter written on lined notebook paper and a small brass key that looked old and important. The letter was dated exactly 2 months before Grandpa died from the heart attack that took him. "Will," it read in his perfect script, "you were always the only one who truly understood what matters in life. Your brother Calvin chases shiny things and surface appearances while you build things that actually last and have meaning. If you're reading this letter right now, I'm gone from this world, and you need something important I left specifically for you." This brass key opens the old meat locker in the back corner of the barn. What's inside that locker is yours and only yours, not theirs, not anyone else's. Trust your gut instincts. You'll know exactly what to do with what you find. The land remembers everything, even when people forget the past. I love you, and I'm proud of the man you became. Love always, Grandpa. I read those words 3 times slowly, trying to fully understand what he was telling me. The meat locker. I remembered it vaguely from childhood, a big metal box bolted directly to the barn floor that Grandpa always kept locked tight. I had asked him about that locked meat locker once, when I was maybe 10 years old, curious about what could be inside. He just smiled mysteriously and told me it held winter supplies and left it at that. I grabbed my flashlight from the truck and headed toward the back corner of the barn. pushing through old farm equipment covered in dust and stacked hay bales that crumbled at my touch. The meat locker was right where I remembered it being, covered in years of accumulated dust and thick cobwebs. It looked exactly like a commercial safe, about the size of a chest freezer, made of heavy-gauge steel with a serious padlock holding it shut. The brass key from Grandpa's envelope slid into the lock perfectly and turned with a solid click. I pulled the heavy door upward and shined my flashlight beam down inside. Metal boxes, 6 of them total, stacked neatly on top of each other. I pulled the first box out carefully and pried open the lid. Cash. Bundles and bundles of $100 bills wrapped in rubber bands that had gone brittle and cracked with age. The second box contained more cash, just as much. The third box was filled with documents, blueprints, property maps, with sections marked in red ink and notes. The fourth box held bank books, old passbooks from the 1970s and 1980s, with deposits recorded by hand. The fifth box contained stock certificates and government bonds with official seals. The sixth box held a handwritten ledger in Grandpa's meticulous writing, tracking deposits, interest calculations, and account numbers. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. This wasn't winter supplies at all. This was a hidden fortune. I carefully spread everything out on the barn floor in the dim light and started reading through the documents, trying to piece together the story. The ledger told me a history I had never known or even suspected. In 1967, Grandpa had quietly leased the mineral rights under his farm property to a small independent oil company called Summit Energy. They'd found something valuable down there, not a huge gusher, but enough to pay steady, modest royalties every single quarter for decades. Grandpa had taken that royalty money and quietly, secretly invested it. Certificates of deposit at local banks, government treasury bonds, stock in solid, reliable companies. He'd told absolutely nobody about any of it. Not his wife, not his sons, not a single soul. Over 40 years of careful compound growth, the money had multiplied substantially. The ledger showed accounts scattered across 5 different banks in 3 counties, most of them still actively earning interest even after his death. I found the most recent statements from just weeks before he died, carefully filed in order. The total across all accounts was over $200,000. Plus the cash sitting in the metal boxes, which I estimated at maybe another $50,000. $250,000, hidden in a barn, sitting here waiting for me all this time. And then I found the will tucked in the bottom of the 6th box. It wasn't professionally typed by some fancy lawyer in an office. It was handwritten on legal paper in blue ink, but it had been properly notarized by Bernard Walsh, Grandpa's old friend who used to run the hardware store before retiring. The date stamped on the notary seal was from exactly 1 week before Grandpa died. I, Eugene Thompson, being of sound mind and body, leave all assets contained in the meat locker at the farm property to my grandson, William Thompson. My grandson Calvin is specifically and deliberately excluded from this inheritance for reasons stated below. Calvin values appearance over substance. He takes shortcuts instead of doing things right. He doesn't finish what he starts. He would waste this money on trucks and toys and things that don't matter. Will is the true soul of this family. He understands that real wealth isn't what you show off to impress neighbors. It's what you build quietly over time with patience and discipline. I sat there on that dusty barn floor and cried actual tears for the first time since Grandpa's funeral. He had seen Calvin's true nature years and years ago, long before the truck incident. And he'd taken steps to protect me from it, to give me something that couldn't be stolen or manipulated away. But there was a serious problem I discovered as I kept reading carefully through all the documents. The mineral rights contracts were solid and still legally valid. That much was clear. But they required legal ownership or control of the surface land to actually access the payments and negotiate new leases. And the property itself, I knew from family gossip over the years, had been sold at auction years ago for unpaid back taxes after Grandpa died and nobody paid the bills. I called the county clerk's office first thing the next morning when they opened and confirmed my worst fear. The 40-acre farm property had been auctioned off by the county in 2019 for tax delinquency. The winning buyer? Redwood Properties LLC. I searched the business registry database online and felt my stomach physically drop when I saw the name. Redwood Properties was registered to Calvin Thompson at his home address. My brother owned the land. He'd bought it dirt cheap at the county auction, planning to flip it someday for a quick profit when the market improved. He had absolutely no idea what was sitting underneath the surface. Grandpa's hidden fortune was legally locked under property that Calvin now owned. The irony would have been darkly funny if I wasn't so absolutely furious. I spent the next 3 solid days researching mineral rights law at the public library, reading thick legal books and old case files. The librarian, a kind older woman named Harriet who remembered Grandpa from church, helped me find the right reference books and legal precedents. The law in our state was actually very clear on this issue. Mineral rights and surface rights are completely separate legal entities that can be owned by different parties. Grandpa had sold the surface land decades ago, but kept the mineral rights, which he'd then leased to Summit Energy. Those specific rights passed directly to me through his notarized will. Calvin might own the dirt on top, but I owned everything valuable underneath it. The problem was practical access. The current lease with Summit Energy had expired back in 2018 and not been renewed. To negotiate any new lease with modern energy companies, I would need Calvin to legally allow surveyors and drilling equipment onto the surface property. He could refuse access just to spite me, just to be cruel. I needed real leverage. I needed him to not know what he was actually sitting on top of. I needed to play this situation smarter than I'd ever played anything in my entire life. I started carefully by cashing in the smallest bonds from Grandpa's collection, about $15,000 worth of treasury bonds. Then I walked into Calvin's favorite coffee shop, the place where he held court most mornings, showing off and telling exaggerated stories about his sales success. He saw me come in, and his whole face immediately lit up with that cruel, mocking smile I'd grown to hate. "Will. Hey everybody, it's my big brother. How's the postponed wedding going? Tina still hanging around, or did she finally see sense?" People at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably. Looking down at their coffee cups, I kept my voice completely steady and calm. "Actually, I'm here with a business proposition for you. I want to buy the old farm property from you, the barn and the acreage." Calvin's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. "The barn? That falling down dump? Why on earth would you want that worthless property?" I shrugged casually. "Sentimental reasons. It's Grandpa's place, lots of memories. I've got some money saved up from working overtime. Thought maybe you'd want to sell it since you're just holding it for investment anyway." Calvin leaned back in his chair, calculating quickly, and I could practically see the greed forming in his eyes. "That property's worth at least $30,000 at current auction value according to my realtor. But for you, special family price, I'll let it go for $60,000. He was literally doubling the price, just to hurt me, just to twist the knife. I didn't let myself smile or react. "You're going to regret that number, Calvin." I walked out of that coffee shop without saying another word, leaving him confused. I called Bernard Walsh that same afternoon, the notary who'd witnessed Grandpa's will 5 years ago. He was 80 years old now, but still sharp as any tack. When I showed him everything from the meat locker spread out on his kitchen table, he smiled broadly. "Eugene told me you'd come eventually," he said warmly. "Smart man, your grandpa. He planned this perfectly." Bernard connected me with a mineral rights lawyer he knew from his hardware store days, a specialist who took one careful look at all the documents and actually whistled aloud. "This is completely airtight legally," he said with certainty. "You own what's under that land. Your brother can't touch it, can't claim it, can't do anything about it." The lawyer filed all the necessary paperwork to officially reactivate my rights claim with the county. Then I hired a geologist to do a quiet survey of the property using only public records and satellite imaging data. Nothing that required physical access. His detailed report came back exactly 2 weeks later. The property sat directly on top of a significant shale gas deposit. With modern horizontal drilling technology now available, it was definitely worth leasing to the right energy company. His estimated value for mineral rights lease? Somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 upfront, plus substantial long-term royalties on whatever they extracted. I contacted 2 major energy companies currently operating in our region. Both were very interested when they heard the details. Very interested indeed. One company, Apex Energy, offered me $450,000 upfront for a 20-year lease, plus 15% royalties on all extraction, but they absolutely needed surface access to bring in their equipment and drill. I told them to wait and be patient. I had a plan forming in my head. I registered a new LLC using my middle name, Thompson Holdings, keeping it completely separate from my personal name. Then I contacted a real estate broker 3 counties away, someone who'd never heard of our family drama, and had him approach Calvin about purchasing the farm property. The offer was for $35,000, slightly above market value, but well below what I'd offered directly. Calvin called me just 2 days later, actually laughing with delight. "Will, you're not going to believe this. Some idiot from out of town just offered me $35,000 for that worthless barn property. I'm definitely going to take it. See, I told you I'd make money on that dump eventually. Everything I touch turns to gold." I kept my voice completely neutral and supportive. "That's great news, Calvin. Good for you. See? Things work out for people who take chances." He had absolutely no idea he was selling directly to me. The closing took exactly 3 weeks to process through the title company. Calvin signed every single paper with a huge grin on his face, joking with the title agent about how he'd beaten some out-of-town sucker. The property officially transferred to Thompson Holdings. The lawyer filed the deed at the courthouse, and just like that, simply and cleanly, I owned both the surface rights and the mineral rights. Everything Grandpa had left me was now completely accessible. The very next day, I signed the lease agreement with Apex Energy. They wired $450,000 to my business account within 48 hours, the fastest money transfer I'd ever seen. Then their geologists arrived with trucks full of survey equipment, setting up on my property to start the preliminary survey work for drilling permits. I drove out to the property one sunny afternoon to watch them work. Calvin's red truck was parked on the road nearby. He'd apparently seen all the activity and driven over to investigate what was happening. When he climbed out of his truck and saw me standing there, his face went completely white like he'd seen a ghost. "What are you doing here, Will?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "I own this property now," I said simply, calmly. Calvin's face twisted through confusion and then sudden rage as the pieces clicked together. "You bought it? How? You said you were broke. You said you had nothing." I smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. "I never once said I was broke, Calvin. You just assumed that because you stole my wedding money and thought you destroyed me. I just let you keep thinking about it because it was useful." His eyes darted frantically to all the drilling equipment, the trucks, the workers in hard hats. "What's all this activity? What are they doing here?" I shrugged casually. "Oil and gas survey team. Turns out Grandpa's old property sits on top of a pretty valuable shale deposit. The mineral rights he left me are worth about $500,000 up front, plus royalties for the next 20 years. I watched the realization hit him like a freight train. He'd owned this exact property for 3 full years and never bothered to check what was underneath. Now he'd sold it to me for $35,000 when it was worth 10 times that amount. He'd literally handed me a fortune while thinking he was the clever one. "You tricked me," he whispered, his voice breaking. I shook my head slowly. "No, Calvin. I gave you exactly what you asked for. You wanted to sell. I bought it. You set the price. I paid it. That's called business." I climbed back into my truck and drove away, leaving him standing there in the road next to all his mistakes. 1 month later, I rolled into town in a modest new pickup truck. Nothing flashy or expensive, just clean and reliable. Calvin saw me at the gas station, and his face went red with anger. "Thought you were broke?" he asked again, like a broken record stuck on the same line. I just smiled calmly. "Not anymore, Calvin. Not anymore." I didn't elaborate or explain anything further. I didn't need to. The whole town had started hearing detailed stories about the major drilling operation on the old Thompson property. People asked me direct questions. I answered honestly every time. Grandpa had left me valuable mineral rights. They were worth significant money. I'd leased them to an energy company. The money was good. Really good. Meanwhile, Calvin's shiny red truck was starting to show serious problems. He'd bought it with zero down payment, 100% financing, and his sales job wasn't going nearly as well as he'd bragged. He'd already missed 2 monthly payments. I heard through the family grapevine that the bank was calling him constantly, threatening repossession. Tina came to see me one quiet afternoon, standing on my porch looking embarrassed and small. "Will, I'm so sorry about everything," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I should have believed in you from the start. I should have stood by you when things got hard. My mother was completely wrong about you. You're a good man. Better than I deserved, honestly." I listened quietly without interrupting, letting her say everything she needed to say. She kept talking, the words tumbling out. "Can we try again? Can we still have that wedding we planned? I was wrong to doubt you." I looked at her, really looked at her closely. This was the woman who'd pulled away from me the moment things got difficult, who'd let her mother's harsh words poison her faith in me, who'd started planning her exit the second my brother stole that money. "Tina," I said gently but firmly, "you showed me exactly who you were when things got hard. I'm actually grateful for that. It saved me from making a much bigger mistake down the road." Her face crumpled like paper. "But Will, we can start completely over. You have money now, we can have a beautiful wedding." That single sentence told me absolutely everything I needed to know. I wasn't broke anymore, so suddenly I was husband material again. "I appreciate you coming by," I said carefully. "But I'm done starting over with people who only see my value when I have money. I'm building forward now, not backward." My mother showed up at my door next, appearing without warning on a Saturday morning. She didn't apologize or admit she'd been wrong about anything. She just sat at my kitchen table and said flatly, "Calvin's in serious trouble, Will. The truck is being repossessed next week. His wife is talking about divorce and taking the kids. You have all this money now from Grandpa's mineral rights. You're doing well. You should help him. He's your brother. Family helps family." I poured myself coffee slowly and sat down across from her at that table. "You told me Calvin needed that wedding money more than I did," I said calmly. "You said he needed to look the part for his job, that I'd bounce back because I always do. Remember saying that?" She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "That was different. He's really struggling now. His life is falling apart." I took a long sip of my coffee. "So was I when he stole from me, when he ruined my wedding plans. You didn't care then. Why exactly should I care now?" Her face hardened into that familiar, stubborn expression. "Because family helps family. That's what we do." I shook my head. "No, Ma, family respects family first. Calvin didn't respect me. You didn't respect me. Actions have consequences. He made his choices." She left angry, slamming my screen door hard enough to rattle the frame. The town started seeing things very differently after that. I donated $50,000 to build a new community center in Grandpa Eugene's name. I hired local contractors for all the construction work, putting people to work who desperately needed jobs. I sponsored the entire Little League team with new uniforms and equipment. I paid off the volunteer fire department's equipment loan that had been hanging over them for years. Suddenly, Will Thompson wasn't the pathetic older guy who couldn't stand up to his own brother. I was the man who honored his grandfather's memory by lifting up the whole community. People who'd ignored me before now waved when I drove past. The shopkeepers knew my name. Meanwhile, Calvin became a cautionary tale everyone whispered about. The guy who stole from his brother and bought a flashy truck instead of securing his future. The truck got repossessed exactly 3 months after he bought it. His wife filed for divorce and moved back to her parents with the kids. He moved into a cheap apartment on the very edge of town. I didn't gloat about his downfall. I didn't have to. Calvin tried to fight back legally one last time. He hired a lawyer who claimed the mineral rights transfer was invalid, that Grandpa hadn't been mentally competent when he wrote that handwritten will. The judge looked at the notarized document, examined Grandpa's clear handwriting, listened to Bernard Walsh's detailed testimony about Grandpa's completely sound mind, and threw the case out immediately. "Your grandfather was meticulous and clearly competent," the judge said firmly. "This will is absolutely airtight. The mineral rights are legally transferred to William Thompson." Calvin stood in that courtroom looking completely destroyed, his last hope gone. His lawyer had taken his last $3,000 for absolutely nothing. I walked past him on the way out of the courthouse. He grabbed my arm desperately. "Will, please, I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. Can't we work something out? I'm your brother." I looked down at his hand on my arm until he finally let go. "You made your choice, Calvin. You chose a truck over family. Now you get to live with that choice forever." Outside the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months, like a weight had been lifted. I drove out to the cemetery where Grandpa was buried. The headstone was simple gray granite, just his name and dates. I knelt down in the grass and placed my hand on the cold stone. "I kept your tools sharp," I said quietly. "I stayed the course. Did it your way, Grandpa." I left a folded copy of the mineral rights lease agreement tucked under a small rock at the base of the headstone, along with a copy of my first quarterly royalty check. $127,000 for just the first 3 months. Grandpa had set this all in motion decades ago with careful planning and patience. He'd built something that would last long after he was gone. He'd trusted me to be the kind of man who would use it wisely and well. I wasn't going to let him down or waste what he'd given me. As I walked back to my truck, I thought about everything that had happened over these months. Calvin had stolen $10,000 and thought he'd won some kind of victory. Grandpa had left me $250,000 in cash and bonds, plus a fortune in mineral rights, plus the knowledge that I was worth believing in. 6 months later, I stood on the property watching the sunset behind the drilling rig. The royalty checks came every quarter now like clockwork, steady money that would last for decades. I'd paid off my house completely, set up a college fund for whatever future I might build, invested the rest wisely, following Grandpa's example of patience and planning, not flash and show. Calvin still lived in that cheap apartment on the edge of town. My mother still called occasionally, asking me to help him, but I'd stopped answering those calls months ago. Tina had moved to another town, started over somewhere fresh. And me? I was building a life I was genuinely proud of for the first time in years. Calvin had taken $10,000 and thought it made him bigger, more successful, more important. Grandpa had left me the actual tools to build my own justice, my own fortune, my own future on solid ground. The real treasure wasn't even the money sitting in my accounts. It was knowing I never had to become like them. Never had to sacrifice my integrity for a shiny truck or my family's respect. Some people inherit money and waste it immediately on things that don't matter. I inherited something far more valuable than money. I inherited integrity, patience, and the knowledge that doing things right always wins in the end. And that's worth more than any truck, any wedding, any amount of money. That's worth everything. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had family betray you over money? How did you handle it? I read every single comment. Thanks for watching.